Kathryn Nicolai. How are you?
Fantastic. How are you, Graham?
Oh, that's the voice of calm right there. I'm very, very good. We were talking just before we went live, and you said you're a professional at being calm.
In both areas of my career, I'm a yoga teacher and a bedtime storyteller, so I have to be professionally calm. It comes quite naturally, though.
Before we get on to your fabulous, massively successful podcast for podcast radio. Oh, by the way, I should just say I'm Graham Mack, and I host the Pod 20 on podcast radio, 5 p.m. on Sundays, which is a countdown chart. But I also talk to the podcasters who make the chart. And Kathryn Nicolai is the host of a fabulous podcast called Nothing Much Happens. It's bedtime stories for grown-ups in which nothing much happens to send you off to sleep, because sleep is the most important thing you can get. We're going to talk about
Really?
the podcast probably at length. Before we do that, let's find out about you. Where are you right now?
I am in Michigan, about 20 minutes, or I'm sorry, about an hour north of Detroit.
Okay.
So in Michigan, we can show everybody on our hands where we live. Right
Yeah.
there.
I've been to Michigan.
Mm,
I went to the Henry Ford at Dearborn,
nice.
which is where the Ford car plant is, and there's an amazing museum there that Henry Ford put together.
Yeah.
Have you been?
Yes, definitely. It's beautiful.
It's amazing to have the convertible that Lincoln was shot in only a few yards away. Sorry, the convertible that Kennedy was shot in.
I knew what you meant.
It's a Lincoln, though.
Yeah.
The convertible that Kennedy was shot in is only a few yards away from the chair that Lincoln was sitting in when he was shot at the Ford Theater.
Yeah,
Bizarrely
there's a
enough,
lot of connections.
there is there is that thing, and also the bus that Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on. It is an interesting museum in Dearborn. So, how far are you from there?
Probably about 45 minutes. Not too far at all.
Okay, and Detroit's had its issues over the years, hasn't it?
It is, and I'm actually from Flint, Michigan, which,
Ooh,
um,
okay.
yes.
Where the water was
But we are
bad.
survivors in Michigan. That's one thing you can say about us.
Yeah. So what kind of upbringing was it?
Um, you know, s- Flint in the 80s, a lot of people are aware of Flint now because our water has been poisoned and is still poisoned with lead. But Flint in the 80s was not easy either because it was the world headquarters of General Motors. And then General Motors left Flint and closed almost every factory. And almost every person I knew, every neighbor, worked for GM or worked for a company that worked for GM. So suddenly an entire town was out of work. So it wasn't an easy place to grow up in. But I also think that people from Flint, kind of like I said, they're survivors and they're used to doing for each other. So there's actually a great like neighborly feeling there of people feeling like, well, we're going to have to take care of each other because nobody else is coming to save us.
Was your family directly affected by that, by the closure of GM?
Yeah, my dad worked at the shop for a while, which is what we all call GM. We just call it the shop. He worked at the shop for a while and lost his job. And my parents married uh, like 3 or 4 days after some major closures. And they said they opened up their wedding envelopes and there'd be $1 or $2 inside them because it was all people could give them, because all of their friends had lost their jobs and everyone's property values went down and
You
neighborhoods
said
turned into
wedding
ghost towns.
envelope. Did you say wedding envelopes?
Yeah, at my parents' wedding, when they got their, like gifts of wedding
I see. Of
envelopes,
cash, yes, I see.
yeah,
Right.
they got
And oh, I
$1 or $2,
get you. People just gave what they had, and it wasn't
that's
much.
and that was it. That was all that people had. So they thought they were going to go on a honeymoon. Instead, they drove down to Detroit for 2 nights at a hotel.
Right. So how did that affect you? How old were you when this all happened?
I was born in 1980, and we lived right in Flint till I was probably about 9 or 10 when we finally were able to afford to move to another place. But I think that that's when I started telling my bedtime stories to myself. That I was probably looking for an adaptive way to feel safe at night. There was a lot of violence. We lived right next door to a house that sold drugs that was known as just a drug house, and people were shot when we lived next to it. And one time the police came to bust up the drug house, but we had the same house number as them, just on a different street, and they came into our house, and it was my mom and
Armed
just me and
police.
my, yes, just broke down the door. And we were really young. It was just my dad was at work, and my mom was by herself with 2 children at 10 o'clock at night, and with 20 cops running into her house. So I think that was a moment for my mom where she was like, I don't care how much money we lose. I don't care how, if we have to live in a truck, we're going. and yeah, so I think that it's been part of my life that I've had to always learn how to soothe myself and find someplace comfortable and safe to tuck into at bedtime.
So you've got economic issues, unemployment issues with the family, which of course the economic issues. There's crime all around you. But when you go to bed at night, you're telling yourself stories. You're going to another place. Is this just to get to sleep, or is this just to find a certain amount of peace?
Probably both, to come down from the anxiety that was just ubiquitous and was the air that we breathed in those days. And that's obviously a feeling probably everyone can relate to after the last, 14 months, is that, anxiety is just part of our day-to-day experience. So I think I use those stories to soothe myself, to try to take my mind someplace where I felt really safe, because I didn't always feel safe even in my own home.
Was it about control as well, do you think?
Probably not then, but I've had lots of experience with that as I get older, of trying to control scenarios. And that's been a big part of my mental health, is sort of noticing what coping mechanisms are about control. I think as a kid too, I also just had a big imagination. And I loved the fact that I could create anything in my mind. I felt like, does everybody do this? Like, this is so great. You can go anywhere in your mind and you can make anything. And so I was always excited to get into bed at night and turn off the light and dream something up. So I think that was probably the shiny, healthy part of it, is that I just had a big imagination.
Now, a lot of people are going to think that you have got this imagination, you can create this world and these stories, that you are picturing these stories and events. You know where I'm going.
Mm-hmm.
But what I found out about you is you don't have the ability, the thing that we call the mind's eye, to create pictures in the mind. Is that a fair description of the condition you have?
Yep, that's exactly it. I might have an inner eye, but it's blind. I don't have access to any visual imagery in my brain. And so this is a condition called aphantasia, and I have it in a complete sense, which means all my senses are blind inside me. So some people can remember the way something smelled, or they can remember the way something sounded, or even like a tactile sensation, and recreate the experience inside themselves, as well as like remembering how something looked. I have none of that, and I have no inner monologue. So it's very quiet in here.
There's no soundtrack either.
Mm-mm.
There's no voice in your head, there's no pictures in your head.
No.
So when you say you created these stories and these worlds and stuff, what is it? If it's not dialogue and it's not pictures, is it feelings?
I think it's concepts, but they're not necessarily voiced, and I can't see them. I'm thinking my way through thoughts and ideas, through how something would feel, but I can't feel it. Sometimes people with aphantasia explain it like, remember when computers had a tower and a monitor? And it's kind of like our monitor is on, but it's not facing us. We can't see it. So maybe even the images do get created, but I can't see them. So it's really hard to explain because I've never known my brain to be any other way. But I'm thinking my way through concepts, and I'm understanding what it might feel like, but I can't in any way recreate a sensory experience.
So if this was totally normal to you, when did you realize that it wasn't? That most people have pictures and soundtrack?
I realized it a couple of ways. One was we were redecorating our house, and my wife kept trying to get me to consider what it might look like if we did this or that. You know, picking paint colors. What if the cabinet in the bathroom was black? And I would just think, how could a person know that? And that's finally what I said. I was like, how could you know that? That to me is like, you've got a bag of marbles and you say, which color marble will I take out next? I can't say until you take it out and show it to me. It blew my mind. And my wife's like a super visualizer. She can picture every part of the room and remember stuff. And so I started kind of looking into it. And I also had a moment where a friend was telling me about some police drama where they were doing that thing where they describe what someone looks like and they draw it. And I've always been really skeptical of how that could be real. How could you do that? I don't understand. So I had said something to somebody like, that's not real. Like, nobody could do that. And she said, I think you should Google this.
So what age were you?
No, this was just like 5 years ago.
Wow. So you went through most of your life not knowing you were special.
Yeah, and most aphants don't know because we're just used to the way that we experience life. And when y'all say picture it or see it in your mind's eye, we don't think y'all are being literal. We think you mean like know the concept of what that would be. We don't think you guys, like most aphants, we don't think you guys really see stuff. So when we find out no other people can actually visualize things, usually we're kind of dumbstruck by that.
And do you dream?
Mm-hmm. My dreams are very visual. So while I'm having them, I experience that. But I can't wake up and recall the images.
So you do get images. You do get images in dreams then?
Yep. And most aphants do. Right.
It's weird that you then become a creative writer and storyteller with that. Because for me, I've got to admit, I can't connect that because I narrate audiobooks and I work with a lot of authors. And when I narrate the stories, because there's lots of characters, you know, I do a lot of work with Danielle Pye in Florida, and she writes these fabulous science fiction books with amazing characters. And I have to be the voice of the character. And I see the character in my mind, exactly what they look like, the stories, the insides of the spaceships. And I see everything as I'm reading. In fact, I don't know if I could do it without the visual. So I'm having a really hard time working out how you create stories, which to me are creating images.
Yeah, I know. I just had another author reach out to me from the UK who we've kind of been friends and been emailing, and she just had read about that I had aphantasia, and she was like, "Please explain to me how you write."
Yes,
please. How
do you do? What did you say?
I said, all I can say is that I've never known any other way of being. So, I mean, I'm thinking my thoughts. I just am not seeing or feeling them. And she said, but you write so much about sensory experience. It's like the heart and soul of what you write is how things feel and look. And I was like, I can't explain it. It's just the way that my brain works.
But the key is it does work.
It does work.
So how did you get into yoga and meditation then? Why did you go that way?
That was coming through college back, 21 years or so ago, and just needing to find some way to take better care of myself. I had an eating disorder. I had a lot of I'd mentioned those control issues. That's all based in that. And I was an over exerciser and sort of all the things that go with that disorder. And I found yoga, and it just felt like it was sort of love at first experience, that I was just like, oh, this is the key that I've been looking for, that opens the door that I can walk through and be a healthier person. So I was 19 and started to practice and found a really great teacher and started to sit meditation and trained to become a yoga teacher in 2003, and then opened the studio I'm in right now in 2006. So we're about to have 15 years.
Oh, well done. Congratulations. I have
Thank
to
you.
say, I enjoy meditation because the old joke is it's better than sitting around doing nothing. When it is actually sitting around doing nothing. And that's what
Yeah.
I like the best about it. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm a little anti-exercise. And I wonder if yoga is, for me, is like, I don't do yoga. And it bothers me that, like, oh, you've taken something I love, which is sitting doing nothing, and you've stuck exercise onto it. Do the two work better together than separately? Because exercise is good for you as well.
Yeah.
Do the two work better together than separately?
For me, they do. For me, that's always been the roots of yoga, is that it would have this mindful experience as part of the movement. So for me, and I do lots of other kinds of exercise just for fun or for health, but I really like that feeling of being very directly tied into my body and feeling my weight shift or feeling something stretch. It could be very slow. It could be very, it doesn't have to be, a super vigorous experience. But to me, it's just another way to meditate, because I'm just watching moment to moment as things change in my body. I feel things, they rise and fall. I do the same when I meditate, but now I'm moving.
I get
Um,
that. I get the breathing thing would
mhm.
really would really work because of the
Yeah,
breathing involved in meditation and being mindful. Yeah, but the
yeah.
exercise I'm going to leave alone.
Well, if you want to come to any of my Zoom classes, I teach
You do
most
Zoom
days.
classes,
I
okay?
absolutely do. We have to be flexible right now,
I
pun
don't know how I'd look in
intended.
a leotard though. That's the thing.
Well, you don't have to wear a leotard. You can wear whatever you're comfortable with and just give it a try. But it's not for everybody. That's okay.
Yeah, and so you've got these stories that you're making up to calm yourself and get yourself to sleep. When did you get to the point of, hey, this should be a podcast?
Yeah.
And you've done a book too. Was the book first?
No, the book was second.
So yeah, see, a lot of people would have gone book first. So
And
how
I
did that all
wanted to go
happen then?
book.
How did that all come together?
I wanted to go book first, but as a layperson who had no connections to the publishing industry, I had no idea how to do that. And so I had written some stuff and kind of put it on a shelf because I was like, I couldn't figure out how to get that into the hands of a publisher. I knew it would have to be an illustrated book and it would have to be a real book and be beautiful. And I thought, this is an expensive endeavor. I'm not sure who would take me on. So I was ironically up in the middle of the night with a sick dog. And I'm just sitting there on the floor in my living room, and it was like a light bulb moment. I went, oh, it's a podcast. It's a podcast. Because I felt all the time like I had this superpower. I can go to sleep, I can stay asleep. Most adults struggle with that. And I kept thinking, how do I get it from my brain to yours? And I already had a podcast for my yoga classes. So I was familiar with the technology. I was ready to get started. So right there on the floor at 3 a.m, I ordered a microphone and we launched about 3 or 4 weeks later. And at first I thought, this is so niche. I don't know who's going to find this. It turns out it's not niche at all, because pretty much everybody at some point in their life can relate to the feelings of being anxious and sleepless. And so almost immediately it started to find a pretty big following.
When did you know? Because I think it was it. I mean, you got 1 million downloads at some stage. Was that? I'm trying to. I want to say episode 13, but I don't know why I've got that in my head. When
It
did you
could
know?
it could be by episode 13. Now we're over 35 million downloads.
Wow.
And yeah, and we do about 2 million a month right now. So
Wow.
I know It is a bizarre feeling to think that so many folks around the world are listening to me, but they're mostly asleep, so that takes the pressure off. But I knew probably within the first 8 episodes, we were like featured in Apple Podcasts New and Noteworthy. And we spent some time on the charts, and then it just became like this steady climb where, more and more listeners every week, every episode. And now, on a good night, we might get 110,000 or 10,000 downloads.
And on the face of it, I mean, there's stories, but the name of the podcast says nothing much happens. That doesn't really sell the story. And surely
that's kind of the point, though.
I know, but surely a criticism of a story would be, "Oh, I put you to sleep." But for you, that's a positive.
Yeah, it's a really weird place to be as a writer.
Yes,
to be writing and I hope they don't even hear this part. I hope that this just puts people down, and it does. People will often tell me, because sometimes I'll post like a quote from near the end of the story or even the middle of the story on my Instagram, and people will say, "I've never heard this, and I have listened to the story 20 times."
And that's a good result, though.
Absolutely. My first goal is just that people sleep and relax. So, as a creative person, you have to give up a little bit the idea that people are going to hear and listen and read and react, because my goal is just kind of that they close up shop.
Now, anyone can write a story, and you already had stories going in, but to continue to keep coming up with them, how do you do that? What's the process? Because now you've got to feed the beast.
I know. And it's gotten harder during quarantine just because I don't write as efficiently in my house as I used to in coffee shops in the library, and I would always be inspired by being out in the world. So I always had like 4 in the bag, and now I'm like 2 weeks ahead of myself if I'm really doing good.
Plus, you're doing less. You're doing less, so the chance for things to inspire you, there are fewer of those moments, surely.
They are, yes. So that has been tricky. I had like a long list going in of just moments I would recognize while I was out in the world. Some thought, some memory, some feeling that I would jot down, and then I could build a whole story around. So I've been working through that. At the same time, I'm writing another book. I'm kind of writing 2 books. So I'm trying to write absolute tons of material every week. And I'm pretty prolific. I'm able to do that. So, but it is tricky. I'm about to get my second shot next week. And then I'm looking forward to maybe being able to go to a coffee shop a few weeks after that.
For anyone watching in England, that's a jab. We call them a jab. But,
a jab.
Yeah, get your second jab, and then you're all COVID. I've had my first one, but not the second one. Yeah.
Me too, but I'm close.
Yeah.
So I'm looking forward to going back to the library and sitting in the library and writing for several hours.
Does that make it easier being out of your comfort zone, out of your house? Because you talked about a coffee shop and that's where you do the bulk of it.
I quite like people watching. I get a lot of inspiration from watching people, and I don't know if I just have my eyes open for it or if it's some greater conspiracy of the universe, but I see people being fantastic versions of themselves, wonderful human beings all the time. And I am looking for it very deliberately. It's part of my yoga work. But I see great things happening every day. So I feel like I want to show those to other people and share them, especially because it's so easy to get on the everything sucks train. Yeah. It has a lot of momentum behind it.
Yeah, I always have the feeling, I think Penn Jillette brought this up, one half of Penn and Teller, that basically most people are good. And, you could park a very expensive car outside a shop, go in and buy something and leave the door open with the keys in the ignition and the car running and come back after you've bought it and the car would still be there. But the problem with the news media is that they, if it bleeds, it leads. And bad news sells. The thing that they don't there needs to be almost a disclaimer on the news, because things are only news if it's unusual. If something,
Yeah.
we don't get on the news that somebody walked home late at night in the dark and got home fine. That doesn't make the
Yeah.
news, because that's what normally happens. What makes the news is if there's a tragic event on their way home, and obviously it's a tragic event. You don't want that to happen, and but that's why it makes the news. So if you think about it that way, the news is actually a collection of unusual things that don't normally happen. And it almost should be, I mean, obviously, COVID has changed a lot of that, because we're all experiencing, and, that's been on a scale that we're not used to. But usually, these terrible things that happen are very, very rare. But because we're fed a constant diet of these rare events, we think, well, this must be the norm, when it's not. It's almost like the news, and now here's a collection of things that don't normally happen. And once it becomes common, it's not in the news. There are areas of the world where horrible things are going on. And a lot of those horrible things don't make it in the news because that has become the norm. Well, that's the weird thing is once it becomes the norm, then you don't hear about it, because in that particular part of the world, people do starve or are attacked or whatever it turns out to be. You only hear about it when those things happen in parts of the world where that doesn't normally happen. And that happens to be, if that happens to be the part of the world where you live, you think, oh, it's getting worse and it's getting bad, and it's really not. So I'm glad you share that observation that most people are good and do good things.
Yeah, the majority of the moments of our life are monotonously safe and good. And, we have this bias built right into us, the negativity bias. It's part of our evolution, that we give more value and time and weight to scary stuff than sweet stuff. It's just what kept our ancestors alive. Worrywarts had more kids. And so now we're in this position where if we don't go out and very deliberately look at the good stuff and pay attention to it, we're going to get a really unbalanced idea of what the world is. So I always say it's not putting on rose-colored glasses, it is taking off the gray ones, because the actual world has a lot of good things happening in it, but our brains aren't built to pay attention to that stuff.
Well, we seek out the bad. I mean, just as an example from podcasting, when I put the podcast radio Pod 20 chart together, it's an amalgamation of the UK and US charts from Apple. That's what it is. It's an amalgamation of that mixed in with recommendations from listeners to podcast radio who can recommend at thepodcastradio.co.uk. When I look at the US chart, I've been doing this show in a few weeks' time. I will have been doing this show for a year. Every week, number one podcast in America is Crime Junkie. It's a true crime podcast. It's been number one for a year. The most downloaded podcast is true crime. There are other true crime podcasts in there too. There's probably about another 5 or 6 in the US chart and about another 3 or 4 in the UK chart. In fact, I think it's probably because of the success of Serial originally, which was a true crime podcast. But people are seeking it out in podcasts, seeking out stories of monsters and horrific crimes and, the journey to solve the crime, which is obviously the appeal of it. But they're not, they're not looking at, white collar crime. They're looking at some pretty sinister stuff. And why is that then? You said that it's an evolutionary thing. Why is it? Is it a survival thing? So that we know where the danger is?
So that we would, if our ancestors were running across the savannah and they didn't stop to smell a flower, no big deal. But if they didn't stop to pay attention to a oncoming mountain lion, they maybe didn't get their genes into the next generation. So it started to become this favored attribute that you would pay more attention to scary stuff and less attention to nice stuff, but stuff that doesn't keep you from getting dead.
Right.
So they let the negativity
that makes
bias.
sense.
So it's built in there. So I think knowing about it is helpful. And sometimes when you see yourself on that everything sucks train, to just go, wait a minute. I don't think I bet I could find some nice things to appreciate in the world. So that's what I try to sneak into the stories is
Yeah,
that I felt like I didn't need to give people, I didn't want to do something instructional on mindfulness because
yeah,
sometimes that can feel quite like a chore.
yeah,
And I just wanted to do it in a way that just made you mindful. It wasn't, this is how to do it. This is just, you're doing it. You didn't even know you were.
yeah.
And now you are.
And you decided you were going to narrate them yourself.
Hmm.
That was a conscious thing. It wasn't a budget thing.
Oh, no.
You decided
These are gold.
you were the only person who could tell these stories.
These are the golden pipes. Absolutely. I never even considered it. I mean, I use my voice all day long in the yoga room. I know how to use it to create a mood. I knew what I wanted it to sound like. So I just went forward, just like knowing that I wanted to read the story twice, that was the really
Yeah.
vital,
And the second
important
time
part.
slower than the first time. Yeah.
Yeah. I knew that would give people permission to fall asleep because even though they know nothing's going to happen, part of their brain wants to stay awake to see what happens. And if you tell them, don't worry, it's going to come back around, they're out within seconds. So a lot of that was just pure instinct.
So did you have any broadcast training or any acting experience or anything going into this?
Yeah, I was in theater from the time I was a young child all the way up into college. So that part to me came real naturally. I knew how to tell a story with my voice. I knew how to use tempo and, even which sounds to lean into so that it felt really soft and relaxing. Yeah, that was all thanks to all the time I spent in Flint Youth Theater as a kid.
And so you sent off for this mic. Was it just a basic USB mic?
I think so, because I didn't have a receiver to plug it into. I just needed to plug it into my computer.
Yeah.
And then I had this friend, Bob Wittersheim, who is an audio engineer. And I called him in the morning and he was like, don't order equipment without me. He was like, no offense, but I will tell you what you should get. And so he had me come into his studio for the first season and I just recorded there.
Nice.
And it's about an hour and a half from my house. So we would do maybe 4 episodes in a day. And then I'd come back in another couple of weeks and we'd do it again. And then eventually we just realized it was a little bit too cumbersome. If I was going to be delivering a new episode every other week, I needed to have a spot in my house. And I have a spot that kind of looks like where you are right now with baffle on the walls.
Right.
And a little recording room. And that's where I record every week.
Yeah, this is actually my first time I've done a video from it. It only got delivered last week. It's a company
Nice.
in Yorkshire called Cube, K-U-B-E, and they come and they build it. And I designed, there's some basic thing, but I designed where I want the shelves because I wanted the computer to be so I could read scripts at eye level and certain things I wanted. But is yours one of those? Because there's some good ones in the US. Is Whisper Room, vocalbooth.com, Studio Bricks?
I just put it together myself.
Did you?
I had a room in my house, that was a dark room that someone used to deliver or to develop photos in. So it's nice. There's no windows. It's in the basement. It's concrete. And it's real small. And so I bought a bunch of baffle and I hung a blanket from the ceiling. And then I just have my little table with my mic and it has one of those background baffles behind it.
Yeah.
So far I think it's working pretty well. Like that.
I did a year. I did 51 audio books in my wardrobe before I got this. So I've really come up in the world. I'm out of the closet. I've come out of the closet.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And you record in the dark.
Yeah, pretty dark, yeah.
So what is the lighting setup then?
I have like this little tiny lamp that I flip over and it just glows like real small. But I am quite light sensitive, so I feel distracted by light. So it is quite dark in there. I just am reading off a tablet and then recording onto my computer, and then I send it to Bob and he fixes all of it.
He does it. He does all the mastering and stuff. because it sounds
Yes.
great. He knows what he's
Thank you.
doing. But I mean,
He does.
he's dealing with the content he's dealing with is A1 anyway, so he probably
Well,
doesn't do
thank
that
you.
much. It's true. And when you read, how do the stories make you feel?
I'm actually quite emotional about them, and sometimes in a way that I can't even explain. I've done a few live reads, and I did one at Christmas time where I read a couple holiday-themed stories, and I cried through half of them. And I don't know why. People often tell me they cry when they listen, and I think it's because it feels so sort of pure and wholesome, and that feels like such a relief after the world you walk around in sometimes all day, to come someplace where just people are safe and respected and have access and nobody's hungry and everything is safe, that I feel like such a relief that I sometimes feel quite emotional. My brother told me that too. He said, I don't know why, but when I listen to your voice, it makes me cry. And I said, this is the effect I have on people. They either fall asleep or I make them cry.
Yeah, people aren't crying themselves to sleep, I hope. Oh,
No,
whatever.
I don't think so.
It's a huge success. And being a yoga and meditation teacher, what yoga and meditation techniques do you use in the stories to put people away?
Well, some of it is based on basic mindfulness, right? Which is just paying attention in a relaxed way. So that's straight out of yoga, but we can apply it to anything. Maybe you're paying attention to the way something delicious tastes, or the way that the air smells when you step outside. Just being still for a moment and taking in the sensory information. That's mindfulness. And when we're mindful, we're in the present moment, anxiety drops. We move out of that default mode of the brain. Your default mode network, I call it DMN because it is like your demon. It's what your brain does when it doesn't have a job to do. And it's that feeling of spinning gears. And if you wake in 3 o'clock in the morning and suddenly it clicks and your brain is racing, you're in default mode. And giving your brain a job to do, what we call coming into the task positive network, shifts you out of default mode. So, and it's the same in yoga. We have to have a job to do. You're watching your breath come in and out.
Yeah.
You're sort of monitoring the physical positioning of your body, noticing where you are in space. All of this, even if it's something very simple, that job shifts you out of the scary default mode. And that's when people relax and they fall asleep. I think I also use repetition quite a bit, which also is part of yoga.
Often in guided meditation, you're asked to picture things. But do you do that because you can't picture things?
Yeah, I can't. And a lot of people with aphantasia think that they can't meditate because that's all they've ever been exposed to. And so, I've actually created like a 30-day meditation course that it's on my website, but I share it a lot with other people with aphantasia if I'm in like groups on Facebook and stuff, because they'll come so frustrated saying, I couldn't do this. I couldn't visualize this thing. So apparently I can't meditate. And no, it's just a different technique. It's not our technique. We can use different ones, and to a certain extent, I can think my way through an image that's described to me. Like I can know that an apple is red, or, that the sky would be blue, but I can't hold it in my head in any way that would hold my attention.
But do you use those phrases when you are teaching meditation? You don't, to people who could visualize it if they wanted to.
It's just not the philosophy I was brought up on. So like my lineage of yoga comes from Vipassana meditation, and Vipassana meditation is basically body awareness and mindfulness. So it's watching the physical sensations in your body. And they always kind of say, like, it's not a mental game. Don't try to visualize something that isn't happening to you. We're not interested in that. We want to notice, how does your foot feel against the floor? What's the weight of your clothes on your back? These are actually happening to you. So maybe that's why I connected with that form of meditation, because I could actually experience what they were talking about.
Is there a form of hypnotism in there too?
I don't know. I'm not quite sure what hypnotism is.
Yeah, neither am I. I was hoping it was, and you could explain it to me, because I don't know what's going on there, right? And I was wondering, with your stories in Nothing Much Happens, whether and because you're trying to send people off to sleep, whether there was a certain amount of hypnotism in there. But it's, as far as you know, it's not.
far as I know, it's not. I really think it is just shifting the brain from one mode network to the other, to that task positive network. That's why I'll say if you wake in the middle of the night, think your way back through. And notice I say think and don't visualize because it never occurred to me, but think your way through whatever you can remember from the story, because it gives your brain a job to do, to remember, oh yeah, I think it started, they were on a walk outside and this happened. And often people will fall asleep within seconds as soon as they shift networks. So that's really, from the neuroscience basis that we're talking about, that's what puts people to sleep. They have to have a job to do, which I often describe as a place to rest your mind, because that sounds a little bit nicer.
Of all the podcasts I've listened to and of all the podcasters I've spoken to over the last 12 months, I think yours is the most unique. And because I can't think of anything else like it. So what podcasts inspire you?
Oh, well, I do love storytelling in general. And I think because I'm not a visual person, audio has always just struck me since I was a kid. I remember the first audiobook I ever listened to, and that my dad had to check it out from the library every 2 weeks for the entire summer because I could not stop listening to it. And so for podcasts, have you heard This Is Love?
No.
Oh, it's by the woman Phoebe Judge who does criminal podcast. But she tells these beautiful, lovely stories about different kinds of love all over the world. And they're just somewhat magical and beautifully voiced and really heartfelt. So that's probably my favorite podcast to listen to that puts me in that place. And then I listen to a ton of audiobooks that also inspire me as far as a storyteller, to see how people craft stories in ways that can be inspirational and not just, I feel like sometimes there's a tendency in the last 10 years or so in literature to just lean into misery, where I just would read book after book where I would call it despair porn, because I was like, it's the most miserable set of circumstances and the least redeemable characters, and it goes on for 500 pages. I was just like, this is like being fed a plate of hot sauce and being told it's a balanced meal. I'm sorry, but there are other things to feel out there. And so when I find other writers who do that, then I'll listen to them, and I'm always inspired by that.
Well, it's working, and it's an amazing podcast. It's hugely successful. It's called Nothing Much Happens, Bedtime Stories for Grown-Ups, and it helps you get off to sleep, which sounds mad that you would listen to something that will put you to sleep, but it isn't a guided meditation or anything. It's a very intimate delivery of a story from the writer. And the writer is Kathryn Nicolai. And thank you for sharing your time with me today and for being on podcast radio. Your show will be on not this Friday, next Friday is when you will be the guest, and then you will pop up various weeks as your podcast is on the chart. And we'll see where it is on the podcast radio chart as well.
Nice. Well, thanks, Graham. This was a great conversation.
It was fantastic to talk to you. Thank you very much, and all the best with everything. If anyone wants to get the podcast, it's in all the usual places: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, everywhere you want to get it, you can get it. It's called Nothing Much Happens.
From any bookseller.
The book from all good booksellers and a couple of bad ones as well.
Yep.
And the book's got the same title?
Also called Nothing Much Happens, and it's really got these beautiful illustrations in it. It has recipes, it has guided meditations, it has a bunch of bonus things in it. I always think of all these stories as happening in the same universe, so there's even a map in the front where you can see where all the places are that are part of Nothing Much Happens. So definitely recommend everyone should go buy several copies of the book.
Kathryn Nicolai. Sweet dreams.
Sweet dreams.